All
Okay.
right. Well, welcome to our podcast, the Psychophiles podcast. I'm joined as always by my dear friend Marshall, and today we're also joined by Dr. Alex Kafkas. So
Thank you very much for the invitation.
I'm very happy that you're here.
Thank you for coming.
Yep. So the first thing that I love to ask my guests, especially if you're doing some research, is what got you into this industry? What got you into academia? And why did you decide to do a teaching role?
Yeah, I mean, it's not a single factor, I would have to say, and it is the outcome of quite a lot of things that came together. And I wouldn't say it's random, but I would say it's not something that you intentionally do as we are starting as a student, for example. So when I started thinking about the academic subject I would like to study, psychology came first in my mind, basically.
All right.
And I grew up in Athens, in Greece. There was a lot of value actually in educating yourself in general. The families wanted their kids to be educated. There is a great value actually in going to university in Greece, where I grew up, and there was a lot of pressure actually to follow a career as a lawyer or as a doctor. The usual
Wow,
choices
really?
actually of prestige. But I started reading about psychology, and back then I wasn't really aware of all the aspects of psychology, obviously. And I had quite a lot of interest. So I also liked history. I also liked different aspects of science. So I think the first book I read on psychology was on behaviorism. So
Okay.
Skinner's and
Skinner, yeah.
Thorndike's ideas on learning and conditioning. I was fascinated. I was fascinated by the way actually they implemented the scientific method.
Yeah.
So this is how I decided on psychology, and then gradually within my within the different landmarks of my studies, within the different eras, periods of my studies, I realized that I really like actually doing research.
Yeah.
And then when I started teaching, I realized that I like doing teaching as
As well. Yeah.
so I wouldn't say that it's a single factor. It's basically a multifaceted aspect that came together and it led here. And I'm really grateful that I'm able to do
Yeah.
this work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Could you tell us a bit about coming to make your decision about doing a PhD, deciding what to research and what your experience was like in that part of your journey?
Yeah. When even from the first year of my studies in psychology, I was pretty sure that I liked neuropsychology and neuroscience. So I was pretty much convinced that if I wanted to do something research-wise, if I wanted to focus on research, I would like to do something in these areas of study. So I pursued a master's in cognitive neuropsychology at UCL in London. And I learned quite a lot of things, so it's a great experience. Obviously, the psychology degree gives you the foundation, gives you the basic elements to build on. And then by the time I started my master's, I was able actually to appreciate different fields within neuroscience and neuropsychology. And I was drawn to cognition in general, but especially so on memory, which was the topic of my PhD and continues to be the topic of my
Yes.
research nowadays and of my teaching as well. It's not perhaps we can say the same thing for every aspect of cognition. It's about life. It's about the human condition in general. It's about how we understand how the human mind works, how it develops, how it absorbs different aspects of information from the environment. But perhaps memory is one of these facets of human life which is so important. It defines ourselves, basically. It
Yeah.
defines who we are. And of course, we can see the effects when it fails. So when we are getting older and our memories start to fade slightly, or when we face conditions like dementias, it can be quite devastating for the person. In a way, they lose parts of the personality, parts of themselves. So I was really fascinated actually by memory. And when I wanted to search for PhD opportunities, when I started searching for PhD opportunities, one of the top topics I had in my mind was a topic on memory.
Yeah.
And I was lucky enough to find a topic for my PhD
Mm.
in memory, and it was at the University of Manchester. So I did
Ah,
my
nice.
PhD here, actually.
Wow.
And Manchester, in general, and psychology in Manchester has a great tradition in memory research.
Mm-hmm.
So it's not really a coincidence that this happened.
Mm-hmm.
So this is how I was drawn to this field of study, really.
Interesting. So, what was your PhD about, if I can ask?
My PhD was about the way novelty and familiarity is integrated in the brain. So, novelty is the experience of new information. So,
Mm-hmm.
every day,
Mm-hmm.
all the time, perhaps, we are experiencing new bits of information around
Right.
us.
Okay.
We may select to absorb this information and encode it into our memory, or we may select to ignore it, or our subconscious mind selects to ignore these aspects
Yeah.
of experience because they are deemed to be insignificant or not that
Yes.
important for the experience. But at the same time, in doing so, which is a very important human function, to be able actually to detect novel aspects of experience and
Mm-hmm.
encode these into memory. At the same time, what we do is we try to classify things that we experience as things that we have experienced before,
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
right? It's the
Mm-hmm.
way to discriminate what's new and what's old in our environment.
Yeah, that is fascinating.
So the integration of familiarity and novelty signals in the brain and in the mind is an important aspect of human encoding, basically, of encoding into episodic memory. And in my PhD, I used methodologies such as functional neuroimaging, so fMRI, and I used a lot of eye tracking as well, which I continue to use nowadays.
Mm-hmm. That's really
Interesting.
interesting. So, I think the question that you raised in your PhD is something that I never really thought about, but now when you point it out, it seems so crucial
Mm,
because how is it that our mind differentiates something that's new
mm,
Mm.
from something that's already within its structure? So somewhere in there, it's encoded. It seems like almost like a philosophical question. So I wonder if in your research you are also interested in kind of bridging that philosophy. So taking, um, as you said, the bigger questions of life and then just trying to make them
Scientific.
scientific. Exactly.
Definitely. I mean, that's the history of psychology as
Mm.
well. So it originated from philosophy, and it approached similar questions as the philosophers did in previous centuries. And we can say that psychology was basically the late child of philosophy. So it was perhaps the last scientific field
Mm-hmm.
which detached itself from
Mm,
philosophy.
mm,
And it approaches philosophical ideas, philosophical questions, but it does so in a scientific way.
yeah.
So
Mm.
basically, the revolution of psychology was the fact that we appreciated that these questions can be approached not just by thinking about them,
Mm.
but also by experimentally studying them
Mm,
and finding ways actually to measure the human condition,
Mm-hmm.
measure the human variables that constitute our mind.
yeah.
Um, and it's a huge revolution if you think about
Yeah.
it. I
Seriously.
don't think that it was an automatic thing. Obviously, nobody really sat down and said, well, let's apply the scientific method.
Yeah.
They just did. Like Ebbinghaus, he started with an interest in learning. He was a
Yeah.
philosopher.
Mm-hmm.
And then he wanted to be a bit more systematic. And in his effort actually to be systematic, he used the scientific method.
Mm.
And he had to personalize to define basically the variables that he would measure. He did this in a very systematic way,
Mm.
and he drew conclusions about the general questions as well. So this encapsulates basically what psychology is about,
Mm.
right? So it's using questions from a philosophical origin
Yeah.
and applying the scientific
Mm.
methodology to explore them.
That is fascinating. I have had the chance to read a little bit about philosophy. I don't know if you're familiar with the philosopher John Dewey.
Yes.
Oh yeah, so he is alongside William James. He was one of the creators of American psychology, and I just found it fascinating how you can break down the human mind, the human thought into discrete chunks, and then try to connect them and say,
Mm.
okay, this is how it starts, this is how an active thought begins, then it progresses into this diverse process, and then you somehow create meaning from that. And it seemed like when I was reading him, I always felt like what I'm studying right now was started through a process like this, like this, just people looking at their life, at their own thinking, just kind of reflecting a little bit, and seeing the broader patterns that emerge from it. And I remember one chapter in particular where, and this is so nerdy, but a whole chapter is just dedicated to analyzing, I think, like 3 thoughts. So there's like this simple thought where you have to deduce at what time your train, how you can get to your train using the existing public transportation system. I think it was in New York. And then there were more complicated, more systematic thoughts that you had to kind of deduce to resolve. So I just found it so fascinating that beginning with that, you can transition into operationalizing, so making systematic the human mind.
Yeah.
And I wonder, it is really fun. It is like, it inspires my curiosity, and I'm sure many students' curiosities as well. But I wonder, when you think of the use of it, do you see that your work is intended to provide a concrete value to, let's say, I don't know, like the creation of more effective applications, or the creation of more effective interventions for mental health? Or would you consider yourself more abstract in that you're doing this because you're just passionate about answering these
For the
questions,
sake of knowledge.
and other people can make use of it if they want?
That's an excellent question, and it's one of the things that every now and again you face as a researcher, in understanding the value of your research and of your contribution. And in a way, you have to do it because you have to apply for grants.
All right.
You have to justify these aspects. So you cannot really say in a grant application or in a paper, I was just curious about it.
Yeah.
And please give me the money so I can do the research. So you have to provide some explanation about the impact these may have, not necessarily translational, so in clinical settings, but the impact in science as well. This is easier said than done, though, because a lot of times you don't really know the impact that something is going to have. And a lot of scientific discoveries were, random in that they were unexpected, they were surprising, and people didn't intend really to invent new ways of doing things, but they did in their effort, in their pursuit of science, right? So I think it's a combination of the two things, really. So to answer your question, it starts from curiosity. It starts from trying to understand how the mind and the brain works, trying to, as we said, transfer philosophical questions into a language that is more psychological and more scientific, in that we can actually measure it. We can define variables that we can measure. We can define manipulations that we can do. And it's like a practice of your own mind as a researcher as well. How can you actually prove that a factor has an important effect on something? So it's like a game, basically, that you can experiment doing a lot of experiments in order to find an answer eventually. Now, this pursuit by itself has some significance, obviously, so it helps us understand how the mind works and how the brain works by implication. But in the long term, I think we always have in our minds nowadays that there could be practical implications about our discoveries. We said about, before we said about face recognition and how it has changed technology. And all of this implementation of face recognition techniques and AI technology into mobile devices, into our computers, has really really began with the cognitive revolution, so the exploration of human cognition. So basically, we can say that the ultimate aim is to make human life better. Whether this means providing new ways of doing things, treating conditions, understanding conditions much better, or becoming more efficient in our everyday lives. And it's one of the things, if you've both seen my lectures, one of the things that I would like to basically transfer to the content I teach to you, that we can use all of these vague ideas, these abstract ideas and abstract questions about memory and learning and theories, which basically are ways of organizing
Hmm.
knowledge. This is what we do when we are developing theories.
Mm.
We can use all of these to understand how we can learn more efficiently, how we can remember more efficiently, um, how we can actually value our previous experiences in the way we retrieve them from
Mm.
memory. So all of these have practical implications about our everyday lives.
Mm.
Yeah, certainly. I can even speak for myself. Maybe this is on a more basic level, but I found your lectures on memory really useful. I remember the first few we learned about the repetition effect, distributional learning,
Yep.
and generation effect, like the testing effect.
Yep.
And seeing that it's grounded in literature and it's actually looking at the studies themselves and how it's scientifically proven. Um, of course, we discussed how that could be applied to learning for students, and I found that really useful myself. Making sure that you're not just doing everything at once, but doing a little bit often, maybe doing it spread out
Yep.
over multiple weeks is way more useful. I didn't realize how true that was. It's something that you get told, but you don't really believe it. You feel like it might be
Yeah.
a waste of time. We even discussed how, or I should say, you taught us how people find it to be less efficient. They report that it's less efficient, even though they report it to be less efficient, even though it's more efficient because it's more time consuming.
I'm surprised that you remember all of these.
Yeah.
I just
Did you
revised it
revise?
recently. Yeah, just a couple weeks ago.
Mm. He
So-
did distributional learning.
Exactly.
Right.
Yeah. That's
Well
right.
done.
Well,
Well done,
and
Marshall.
clearly it was really useful. So thank you for that. With all that being said, do you have any advice for students who have not attended your lectures when it comes to learning and revising and trying to do well in exams?
Any advice? Well, it's difficult to say a specific kind of pathway that you can follow, but as you said, we have evidence that different things that we can do make learning much more efficient. So the distributed studying is something that is quite documented in the literature. The other one is as you said, the generation or the testing effect, so testing yourself. Now, we all have faced the situation where you need to cram our experiences. We need to cram our revisions basically, and we've left everything at the last moment, and we need to revise quite quickly. I think there is no single golden recipe. We can actually apply things that we find the most efficient ways of revising. So these could be summarizing things, using cards to guide our memory, which enables actually to test yourselves as well. I would say one of the best ways of revising in a short period of time is to revisit your notes, revisit your slides, and have a look at the slides that we discussed in the classroom, basically.
Really, just read them again, basically.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Remind yourself about this
Yeah.
content.
I
But
suppose
it's
it
not
like
the best way of revising, obviously,
Yeah.
if you cram everything at the last moment.
Yeah.
But it happens.
yeah. Trying to tie that back into theory, it sounds like that would reinstate the context which you were in when you started
Exactly.
revising that.
So it does that. So when you, as you said, Hugo, when we create memories, we create them not in isolation. We create them together with a context in which we encoded them, and the context is a very helpful factor, actually. And in order to retrieve more efficiently, we may see actually ourselves trying to remember what we did when we heard about something, what we were thinking about when we were doing something else, and in order to remember, for example, where we placed our keys. So in a way, we're trying to retrieve the context, to recreate, to reinstate the context of the previous experience. And we can do the same thing in learning experiences like revising for a lecture. So by looking at even the layout of the slides could actually trigger memories about the content, and that's quite important. Actually, it's an important aspect of episodic memory.
That's
Yeah.
so interesting. What do you think about more fringe advice I've heard a while ago about because it does link in with the theory of chewing a certain flavor of gum when you're revising a topic and bringing that same gum to your exam for that subject. Do you think that kind of context dependent and even that sensory experience of chewing the gum could trigger the memories that you were just revising?
It could be, uh, in that it is like the context. It is a
Mhm.
context that is internal, actually. It's the sensation of taste, basically, which is associated with the encoded material, and it can trigger actually the generation of memories, or it can facilitate more efficient retrieval of memories.
Mhm.
Obviously, it's not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, and it's not like the golden recipe that you're gonna chew the same gum and everything is gonna come to
Yeah,
your
yeah,
mind.
yeah.
It doesn't
You go
work
to a
like
test with
that.
like 30 packs of gum, each
Yeah,
for each concept.
no, it doesn't
Got to
work like
revise.
that.
Yeah.
But it creates a context that may facilitate retrieval from a similar context.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that'd be something interesting to study. Maybe look at the literature on that at some point.
Yeah,
And
definitely.
that brings to mind another thought that I'm having about memory now, and that is, what are some contexts that actually impact memory? Because we can imagine 100 different factors
Yep.
that could be involved in helping you retrieve a memory. Like, let's say you try to remember where you were in that room, or who you were talking to, or what the weather was like. I mean, clearly there must be more efficient and less efficient ways of retrieving a memory. So I'm wondering if there is some theoretical basis for estimating what's the most efficient
Yep.
path to get there.
It's one of the most fundamental questions in memory research, basically, what you said. So the basic question is, why do we remember certain things and we fail to remember some other things? What are the elements actually that define which aspects of the experience we're going to remember? And one aspect is the distinctiveness of the context. So how important it is deemed by our mind. Obviously, we are exposed to quite a lot of experiences daily. We cannot absorb all of this information. So we need to, in a way, to create some pointers in our experience to highlight what is important to remember. And this can be seen as the way of the mind, actually, to try and organize the world. Imagine that you are in this context on a campus. You have a template about what's going to happen, right? So you come here, you know that you will attend some lectures, you will see your friends, and you have these templates, and these templates guide your experience. Let's say that they create some kind of an expectation of what's going to happen, right? Now, every anomaly from that, every unexpected event could be more distinctive in your experience, and this could be quite memorable as an experience. You can think of it as it is applied in traumatic experiences, for example. So experiences where we have an affective effect, an emotional connotation, can be quite important, quite significant. This is because they're quite distinctive. So we basically we live our everyday lives without necessarily having peaks of emotional experience, right?
Right.
And when it happens, and it is quite intense, then this the event that surrounds this experience becomes quite distinctive. So the context itself, going back to the context idea, plays an important role because it defines what to expect and what makes a distinctive experience, right? And this defines the way we are going to encode the information and eventually how we're going to remember the information. It's one of the most fundamental questions in human memory. One question that has actually informed a lot of my research. So I've done some research on expectation and the effect of
Yeah.
expectation on memory. And it's a fascinating subject, a fascinating topic. But one word of caution is that it doesn't apply to all people the same, right? So we're not all the same, obviously. We have different experiences. We carry different templates in our minds. We carry different previous experiences. So all of these should be taken into account. And one factor that is a sticky factor in psychology, but it is a fascinating one, is basically the individual differences we see. So we cannot just look at human studies as groups. We need to appreciate individual differences within the effects that we describe.
Right, right. That's interesting. I wanted to go back a little bit to a point you mentioned about, if we find something to be important, then we encode it better. And you've given like the first outline of what that can mean. If it steps outside of our expectations,
Mhm.
then we consider it important, essentially. If it's maintained within our expectations, then it's less important. It's just fits with what we already
Yeah,
believe.
it's a bit more mundane.
Yeah, it's a bit more mundane. So I'm wondering if just the violation of expectations is that the only thing that defines something as important? Because I try to harken my mind back to um, a few other research papers which I've been reading and listening to about, for example, the emotional significance of something. So just let's say you have more cortisol in your bloodstream,
Mhm.
and that causes you to temporarily not to be able to retrieve things at that moment, but then to remember that experience later on. So I remember that distinction as well. But that seems like
Yeah,
another factor that makes things more important.
definitely. The emotional experience and what we call emotional memory as a field of study within memory research is quite important, and it has been documented actually that emotion can have great impact on the way we remember things. Uh, I would like to see it as connected to distinctiveness and expectation. So experiencing um, high intensities of emotion, it's not something that we expect in our everyday experience. Most of the times we want to feel neutral or normal, let's say. When we have the peaks of activity in emotional reactivity, like when we are super happy about something, when we are super sad about something, when something traumatic happens, all of these are like anomalies in our experience and they become much more distinctive. So I see the emotional experience as part of the distinctiveness of the experience as well. So they are connected.
That's interesting.
So
Yeah.
you think the effect that emotions have on how much you remember something is fundamentally due to its distinctiveness or surprisingness, kind of regardless of which direction it goes emotionally, it's that surprisingness that makes it stand out in your memory.
Yeah, exactly. So this has been studied systematically, in that we start from the premise that emotional conditions should be more memorable. Okay, and this has been documented quite a lot. However, there have been controversies about it. So there are studies where they have shown that extremely negative events may actually not be remembered that well. Why is that? Of course, we may say that it's more efficient to avoid these kind of experiences, right? And not attend to them and not really encode them into memory because they're quite traumatic. A more systematic investigation has shown actually that when we pair emotional experiences together with neutral experiences, then the emotional memory effect occurs in these studies, which means that you need to have a mixed experience together with a neutral. You have the emotional as well, and the emotional becomes more distinctive within the context of the neutral experiences.
Gotcha.
When you expose participants to purely emotional lists, to purely emotional stimuli, like all negative stimuli or all positive stimuli, the effect of emotionality tends to vanish in these situations. So if you compare different groups of participants exposed to either neutral, negative, or positive experiences, it's not necessary to find that actually the negative or the positive would be remembered better, actually. Just because these participants encoded this information in isolation without having the context of the neutral experience. So we go back to the idea of distinctiveness.
Yeah.
So in everyday situations, normally we want to feel neutral or happy. It's the pursuit of happiness, obviously. But when we have negative experiences, which the literature suggests would be much more memorable, they are also quite distinctive as experiences. Could be surprising as well, but definitely quite distinctive. So this is why we have the need basically we don't have really the need, but we pay more attention to these experiences and we encode more things around these experiences.
Oh, that's really interesting. Because I always thought that, I had the impression at least, that memory is something that is still not very well defined, particularly because it's hard to define importance. But it seems like you did a pretty good um, pretty good job in explaining it. So tell me if I've understood what you
Yeah.
said correctly. It seems that the brain, essentially in any modality that you can imagine, whether that's hearing, eyesight, or just the general category of experience, if you look at the broader scale, um, it just tries to separate things by their distinctiveness. So by
Mm-hmm.
their, whether that's
Mm.
literal physical distinctiveness, like black microphone, white background, that's a different thing that we're seeing. Therefore, they're different distinct objects, and it seems like that is the organizing principle. And you've also mentioned efficiency as something that the brain
Mm.
is constantly trending towards. That does seem to resonate with my understanding of another related subject area, which is machine learning,
Mm-hmm.
something that I'm really passionate about and have gotten into increasingly over the last few months. Um, in machine learning, just to give you a little context, you have a concept called gradient descent,
Mm-hmm.
where you start with essentially a unclear idea of what's important and what's not important,
Mm.
and then as you iterate,
Mm.
as you iterate through the machine um, learning training process, you slowly converge
Mm.
on a solution. Of course, sometimes you may be wrong because that is a bit of a tangent, but there can be different sinks.
Mm.
So there can be an incorrect way of interpreting a concept, which nevertheless seems compelling, and I'm sure you can extend that to a lot of like philosophical ideas that have emerged over the last centuries. It's like, yes, it makes sense that the Earth would be at the center of the universe, and it feels like, it makes sense. You can see that the stars are kind of moving around it, the sun
Mm.
is moving around it, and
Mm.
we're kind of stationary. Therefore, it makes sense. But again, that's like an incorrect um, approach towards efficiency. And then we found through continuous input of knowledge that there's another source of truth that's even more accurate. So I find it fascinating how even some abstract and simple things like a machine learning algorithm can mimic or replicate almost the the mathematical underpinnings of a human mind.
Definitely. And if you're interested in this aspect, you will find Carl Friston's ideas on free energy quite interesting. So, first of all, just to say that the idea of having templates and expectations is a very old one. So, starting from philosophical ideas that we basically accumulate experience in order to guide our behavior, it's a very basic philosophical idea that existed for centuries. Um, Psychologists then inherited this idea and we tried to use it in explaining different cognitive phenomena. So one of the phenomena is attention, right, which relates to memory quite a lot actually. And again, we have the distinctive experience and the stimulus overload. Obviously, wherever we are, even in this room, we have quite a lot of stimuli, but not all of them are important,
Mm.
right? So we have to be selective as to what we observe at. The same happens in memory as well. And if you would like to have a look at a mathematical approach and a mathematical formulation of how this works, the free energy principle proposed by Carl Friston encapsulates this very well. And it provides the mathematical basis, actually, of
Mm.
looking at the brain, looking at the mind as a predictive machine.
Mm.
This is what the main principle of this idea is, that the mind tries actually to understand and tries to attend the world by creating templates and expectations. This is what it does basically,
Mm.
and
That's its purpose
this,
almost.
yes,
Yeah.
exactly,
Wow.
and this happens in every aspect of higher cognitive functioning. So we expect to see a red tomato. We expect to see a yellow banana.
Mm.
And then if we see something else, like a green banana, we know that perhaps it's something that we shouldn't really buy it right
Mm.
now because it's not going to be very tasty.
Mm.
So these kind of templates that we create, which can be seen as accumulation of previous experience, accumulation of knowledge, really,
Mm.
is a great principle of our mind. So their mind is like a learning machine. It creates iterations of experiences, and it applies a degree of abstraction. So you can try and draw some conclusions about what you expect to happen. And that way we create the expectations, we create our templates. If you remember, we create what we call a schema, right? So long-lasting knowledge that encapsulates basically our previous experience in relation to specific settings. We guide our lives by basing our understanding of the world on schemas and templates. And that's the reality. If you see a baby, everything is a surprising experience, right? But as they become more accustomed, as they are exposed to more stimuli, then the stimuli that used to be surprising cease to be surprising at some point, right? And that's the best indication of learning, really, and developing of the understanding of the world.
That's so interesting. So just to see if I've understood it correctly, if I can put it really simply, instead of the brain being a blank slate that just downloads information, it's more like a machine that kind of has hypotheses and tests them continually based on the information and says, and can reinforce or I don't know, inhibit.
Exclude.
Inhibit hypotheses based on evidence. Is that basically what it
And
means?
the amazing thing is that it does this in the background. So as we are speaking, as we are exposing ourselves to different experiences, our brain is involved in this kind of hypothesis processing, let's say. It's amazing how it can do all of these things. But we go back to the idea that this is why it has to be selective, right? We cannot attend to everything. We cannot really encode every bit of information. We don't really need to retrieve every bit of information either. So when you are here on campus and you see your friends, for example, or you see a familiar place like a lecture theater, do you need to retrieve all this information? No, it would be devastating, really, to retrieve all of these different experiences from different cues. So again, we have to be selective in our retrieval as well. So by having this constantly working machine, our brain and our mind, we are able actually to guide our experience, right? So this is why this premise that has become quite popular, the last 20 years or so, that we use only 10% of our mind is obviously wrong, right? So we use our entire brain to actually more efficiently process the environment. If we don't use the entire brain, it means that we cannot process all of this information that we are bombarded with every day. So to go back to your question, the amazing aspect is that all of this happens in parallel. All of the aspects of cognition are in a way interweaved, so they happen at the same time. And to us, as humans, they give us a holistic experience, right? So you never have to stop and think, well, now I'm using my memory, then I'm going to use my decision making, then I'm going to use my language and thought, and then I'm going to use this aspect of cognition. The different aspects of cognition that define our human thinking is constructed that way so it works seamlessly at the same time, right? And this is the biggest challenge in psychology and cognitive psychology. How can we dissect, in a way, human cognition into different components, different aspects, and how can we isolate them? How can we see the effects that the different aspects of cognition may have on any given other dimension of cognition, and how can we isolate what we are focusing on from the other aspects of cognition? And I think this goes back to where we started, actually, the idea that psychology brought a scientific exploration in trying to systematically investigate these questions by having meaningful variables, by explicitly actually defining meaningful variables that we can actually measure in order to draw some conclusions. And this happens step by step, obviously. So it's not like we are going to come up with the superstring theory of cognition within the next 10 years. But I think the last 20 or 30 years, we have made huge strides. And this is reflected in technology as well. So machine learning even the invention of the computer itself, the elements that it uses has a lot of, let's say, relevance and relationship with cognitive
Yeah,
psychology
it
and
has
the way.
memory, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it is
Yeah.
organized in a similar way.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff, and it sort of reminds me of something we were discussing with Dr. Jen McBride last week, and I suppose this is more action rather than memory, is more external. But we were discussing utilization behavior. I think that's the right phrase for it, and the implications of that, because the implications of certain neurological patients having impairments that make them act without inhibition is that we perhaps see objects not based on every single property, everything we know about the object, because that would be so taxing for us to do constantly. We see them based on their functions because that's what's useful. So it's kind of a pragmatic way of looking at things. And so I just found that interesting because I guess it's a similar kind of thing where instead of having a blank slate where we try and download information onto a blank canvas, it's also that we don't see objects and make an informed decision every time, thinking about all the context and all the reasons you might or might not do something.
Yep.
You actually kind of default to doing it, and then you have an inhibitory part of your brain that says no. So the decision is kind of restricted down so that it takes less energy. And then that's lost when that part of the brain is inhibited. So it's just interesting how those two ideas kind of merge. The brain is an efficient machine, and it uses actually quite unintuitive things you wouldn't think of, because you assume that you just download information and that you make informed decisions about everything you do. But really, it's quite ingenious how it finds these shortcuts and these different kind of systems, decision-making systems that you wouldn't think of consciously.
Yeah.
Definitely. And it's a very good example of how selective our brain is, basically. And you can see it, from neuropsychology, you can see this quite well when the system fails, basically, right? So when somebody is dysexecutive, so they cannot really control their the experience they get from the environment, and they cannot really apply inhibition techniques, basically. You can see that they're guided by the stimuli in the environment, as you said. They don't have any, what we call a top-down control. They don't have any control of the template. So we go back to the idea of the template. So you know that within this context is not relevant to start hoovering, although there is a vacuum cleaning thing here. Again, this guides your experience and it guides your actions. And it's an example, as I said, of how selective we are actually in our experiences and our actions as well. Another dimension that is important, because we say, you said, Marcel, about the idea of we are downloading information and then we decide, and even this aspect is not that passive, really. So whenever we download a bit of information, whenever we use our previous knowledge, whenever we retrieve a previous experience, in a way we slightly change the memory itself.
It's like pre-processing it.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like reprocessing it again. And because we said about the context, obviously the context in which something was previously exposed with could be relevant. We could retrieve this context, or we could be assisted by the context in our retrieval process. But then imagine that the new context also will play a role in that, right? And you can see it as enriching the memory. So this is why we are saying that memory retrieval itself is a reconstructive process. It's not a process that is a simple passive download of previous experience. And very good examples of this is when memory fails, when we commit false memory, so when we recognize something that it's not really something that we have experienced before. So when the memory fails, it is an example actually of these aspects of reconstructive memory. And again, studying these aspects, studying these phenomena can be quite important and quite interesting, because it shows the limits of our memory, but also the way memory retrieval works in in that it's not a perfect match of the experience. And in a way, this is, we go back to the idea of efficiency again. So it's the most efficient way of doing things. So imagine that when you're exposed to the same bit of information again and again and again, within these experiences, you have different contextual effects.
Yeah.
Now, because of the plethora of these contextual effects, in a way, you apply a degree of abstraction, and you extract the memory itself, you extract the knowledge itself away from the episodic element, away from the contextual element.
Right.
And this is what knowledge is, right?
Right.
So if I ask you now, what is the capital of France, you'll say Paris. You don't really need to remember the context in which you learn this bit of information, because presumably you've heard it so many times that you have allowed your memory system to extract the general idea, to extract the knowledge bit of information away from the context.
Right. Oh, yeah, man, that's so fascinating. Again, it ties back to my understanding of machine learning, but also of another subject, which I'll just get into in a second. And it's fascinating that the co-occurrences, the things that happen the most in the same situation, those are the things that we remember. It's also almost seems like the brain is looking for the things that remain static across different contexts. So, for instance, your mother, when you're an infant, your mother is always there. So you kind of start to separate her out from the background. She's not just like a moving blob in the same way that, let's say, the clouds are moving blobs, which may be less relevant to an infant. But she's the source of a lot of important, useful outcomes, in useful information, maybe useful resources that she can provide you. And so it seems like in the same way, I remember I was working on a little neural network for a workshop, and essentially when you make a neural network, when you build something like that, you're inputting thousands of images, so thousands of different images of the same thing. So for instance, the spleen or the heart, but it's in different contexts. So the environment is different, but the object of interest remains the same.
Right, yep.
So what the machine learning algorithm is trying to do is say, what is the foreground? What is the background? And that is essentially the distinctive process of slicing apart, this is important, this isn't important. And I know that for humans, it's a bit different than for machine learning algorithms, because we have the ability to abstract on very, very complicated levels. So we can like draw ideas out. For instance, we can draw like a causal maps. I remember doing that. And so we can abstract so much that we can use language, for instance, to describe what we're thinking about. And some people, well, the intention is that people will understand what we're saying and then be able to transfer over that knowledge into their own context, which just seems so mind-blowing to me that would be possible, because it's just such a high level of abstraction. So that's a little tangent that I went on. One thing that you mentioned earlier, which I became really fascinated with, was that you said memory is like a reconstructive process. And that when you said that, I thought of imageability as a factor that influences memory. So I know that when a word is very concrete and very visual, like vivid. So for instance,
House.
I don't know, exactly, house, as opposed to freedom, discipline, or vague abstract concepts which are harder to picture. It is easier to understand and remember it. So
you've been revising also.
Maybe I have. I won't say that I haven't. So those concepts are better retrieved. So it seems to follow what you've been saying, that it's reconstructed better because it utilizes more of our senses simultaneously.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So it's the roots of encoding different aspects of experience, really.
Yeah.
So when you say, house, for example, you can visualize it, you can think of it as a word, you can visualize it very vividly as well. Whereas, abstract concepts, politics, it's much more vague. We can still visualize it, we can think of, buildings that represent politics. The House of Commons, for example. But it's slightly more complicated, right? And one aspect that is interesting now that we said about the how we experience concrete and abstract concepts, one aspect of the experience is that we should think about the evolution of language as well within this division here. So obviously, when we started using language, why did we use it? We started using it to describe concrete things, like this is a table, I need food, I need water. These are quite concrete as experience, quite concrete concepts as experiences, and perhaps it was the use of the language that allowed us to communicate our needs, basically, which tend to be much more concrete. But then it became obvious that actually, as human beings, we have needs to communicate more complicated ideas, more abstract ideas. And when we speak about the effect that these may have on memory, it could be quite important in that we tend to generate more false memories, first of all, related in relation to abstract concepts.
Okay.
So in a way, we're saying that they're not, because they're not that specific, and because they may be actually associated with other concepts. So imagine we said the term politics, for example, but we can actually associate politics with politicians, with specific figures from politicians, with the concept of democracy, with elections, with debates. All of these are related concepts. And if I present to you then the word debate, would be more likely actually to have a false memory of experiencing this in a list of words, for example, if we are doing this as an experiment. This is because the abstract concepts are in a way organized in a relational way, in an associative way. And one of the recent findings we had in an fMRI project was that actually the hippocampus tends to be more active when we process abstract concepts. So when we are trying to retrieve abstract concepts, abstract words from a previously presented list of items, from a previously presented list of words, we tend to actually activate, engage the hippocampus much more. Why is that? One explanation could be actually this associative processing. In a way, in order to make sense of the abstract concepts, we need to approach them in an associative way. It's not a single thing. It's not like the table. It's not like your house. It's not a single entity. So it tends to generate quite a lot of associations, which is what the hippocampus does best. So if you remember the hippocampus, and we will see it actually in our lectures subsequently in cognitive neuroscience as you progress in your degree, the hippocampus is a system that allows us to bind together arbitrary associations, right? So a face and a name. So you're introduced to someone, and you would engage your hippocampus actually to connect something like a face with their name. You don't have any other indication of why these two may relate, apart from gender, for example. But apart from that, there is no other indication. So this is why it's an arbitrary association. Now, in order to hold these together, in order to glue them together, you need the hippocampus. And so the hippocampus is a system that allows us actually to create, to generate associations, and to hold these associations in our mind for some time.
Wow, that's so interesting. So I remember we were talking about different models of memory, and you could hopefully refresh my memory on this. The sort of different hierarchical models.
Yeah.
I don't remember their names specifically, but I guess the more abstract ideas and words have more connections? Would you say that's probably the case, or maybe require more connections in order to bring to
Yeah, in order
memory?
to make sense of them,
Mm.
you require actually to base your processing on other concepts, either
Mm.
abstract or concrete ones. So imagine, emotions are a very good example. So when you're trying to consider the concept of love, um, what can you think about? You can think about specific people, which
Mm-hmm.
becomes a bit more concrete. A lot of people think about organs like heart.
Mm.
Um, but we can also generate other abstract concepts like affection,
Mm.
right? Um, which means that in order to make sense to very abstract concepts like this, uh, we require a bit of an advanced kind of processing,
Mm-hmm.
which is achieved by having this associative processing to make
Mm.
sense these concepts,
Mm.
make
Mm.
sense of these concepts. And I think there is a lot of research in semantic memory as well, showing actually that when we process abstract concepts, we are more likely actually to generate activations in a diverse, uh, um, let's say, network
Mm.
of brain regions,
Mm.
as opposed to the concrete ones, which are a bit more
Focused.
specific, more
Yeah,
focused.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, one thing that you mentioned here, uh, which I can relate to my own experience, is that when you have an abstract concept, it almost sounds like you need more processing to retrieve the correct aspect of the memory or the piece of knowledge that you're thinking about. So as you mentioned, politics has is it's multifactorial. There's
Mm.
a thousand things
Mm-hmm.
that you can think of when you think of the idea of politics, whereas as Marshall mentioned, house is much more specific. And that actually reminds me of um, a learning strategy which I've applied for myself, which is that if I can't visualize a concept, if I can't imagine it in my head, that means that I probably don't understand it. So it's, for instance, when I'm reading a book, I have a little bit of a rule for myself that I need to be able to see how these things transform over time. So, how
Yeah.
the concepts which are being presented are being processed throughout the book. Because if I understand books, especially maybe scientific texts or texts which try to illuminate some concept, illuminate, that's even a key word
It's a
here, I
nice
guess.
word.
Yeah, so um, you're trying to process an idea in the same way that the author has processed it. That's the intention, or at least to associate it enough with your existing experiences, to draw on your existing experiences,
Yeah.
to be able to um, derive some value from it. So, for
To
instance, when
make it yours,
yeah,
basically.
to
Yeah.
make it yours. So I mean, when you're reading a research paper, for instance, you're trying to see another researcher's thought process, and if it's if it illuminates some parts of your mind, then you can appreciate that you have understood it. But if, like, a layman were to read a quantum physics paper, nothing would be illuminated because they have no prior experience with
Yeah.
it. It's almost like they're blind to it in a way.
Hmm.
So to me, the idea of like eyesight, of being able to see something in your mind's eye, is seems like a crucial component of actually saying yes, I have understood it versus no, I haven't understood it. And I wonder if you have a um, any relation with your research um, regarding how visual something is, and how um,
Mm.
whether there's a way to actually quantify how imaginable
Hmm.
something was to a person, to an individual.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, the visual experience is the strongest
Mm.
in humans and in other mammals as well. So it's not surprise actually that we base quite a lot of our experience and we retrieve things visually. Or we try to visualize things in order to remember them, as you said. So it's not really a surprise. In mice, it's more the tactile stimulation that is more important, or the olfactory information could be more important in other species. So it is, in a way, it is species specific, but in humans and mammals, the visual experience is the strongest. So it's not really a surprise that actually we process things that way. The other aspect of your observation is that in doing so, in trying to actually assess the degree to which you can visualize information, what you're doing actually is you're utilizing the context that you have created, right? So basically, if you're reading a paper or a book, let's say your cognitive psychology textbook, a lot of times when you have a question about it, let's say that you're taking an exam, you may start thinking about the composition of the layout of the page, basically. So, yes, I remember it was this point that was at the top of the page next to this box. So, this is like visualizing your previous experience and, in a way, contextualizing your knowledge. So, you are recreating the context in order to be able to retrieve the information that you're looking for.
Yeah.
And context is, again, used more efficiently when it can be visualized, because the visual experience is the richest in our experiences. I mean, we said about other modalities as well, like taste and gum chewing and all of these.
Yes.
But perhaps the visual experience is the strongest.
I mean, we look at the brain, and it's clear that the amount of brain dedicated to the eyes versus any other part of the brain is just mind-blowingly
Definitely.
greater.
So this is why there is the idea that whenever we start learning something, it always starts being an episodic experience. So you start learning about a specific theory, you start learning about a specific kind of studies or research, and you tend to associate it with something. It could be someone in lecture theater giving a lecture, your lecturer, the specific composition of the slides, the specific composition of the page, the context in which you learn something about. So speaking to your friends and learning a new bit of information. Again, this becomes the context of the experience. All of this means that this kind of information that you have encoded is an episodic experience. So this means that when you are able to retrieve it, you retrieve it as an episode, as you do with your visual experience. Now, what comes over time, of course, is the abstraction or the extraction of knowledge. So after multiple presentations, after multiple experiences with similar, with these events, with this information, in a way, it becomes something that does not need a specific context anymore. So, as we said, you have a contextual association that you retrieve every time you think about something, a bit of information. You reprocess it under the new context. And then the next time you retrieve it, you may reprocess it at a new context. This, in a way, this process of reprocessing and reconstructing the memory, in a way, breaks the episodic experience.
Yeah.
And the episodic experience stops being important, actually, in remembering
Yeah.
the information. This is why we said that it's not important, actually, to remember where you heard that Paris is the capital of France.
Yeah.
Because you have been exposed to this information a lot of times. It has become knowledge now. And it has broken away, basically, from the context in which you learned it.
So it's a deeper level of processing, I guess.
It's a way of processing that is more abstract.
Okay.
So it's a degree of abstraction, basically, that you have applied. And for many researchers, this bit of knowledge is consolidated. So the concept of consolidation is something quite important in memory research. So once something is consolidated, it means that it doesn't need the episodic support, basically, to be retrieved.
Yeah, this is useful because it links to a question I was going to ask. Because we've talked about how visual cues are really useful, especially compared to other kinds of cues. So if I revise something at my desk, I'm more likely to be able to bring it to memory if I sit at the same desk because of the visual cues and maybe if I use the same PowerPoint slides. But that doesn't seem that useful because when you go to an exam, you're in an exam hall and it's completely different surroundings. So would you say that the issue is less about trying to make the
context the same.
yeah, when it comes to
Yeah.
giving the exam when it's the most important time to have it, or is it more about just trying to get it consolidated and
Abstracted so much that
Yep.
it's independent of context, and you can
yeah,
apply it anywhere.
and not
I-
using the
maybe that's
visual
it.
cue because it's not
Yeah.
that useful in the end.
Yeah.
That's a great observation. Actually, it's the basically it shows how short term the experience of episodic memory is. Basically, in a way, what you're saying is that if you start reading something and you start exposing yourself repeatedly to the same bit of information, you don't really need the visual information anymore to retrieve it. It has become almost second nature, let's say, and it has become part of your knowledge system. So you move away from the contextual hinges that are associated with this experience. However, because most of the times what we do, the way we learn things, is that we are exposed to the information. We have a short period to revise, and then we take an exam, as we do in a university. The chances are that this knowledge that you have accumulated over a period of a few months has a lot of contextual detail.
Yeah.
So this is why we're saying that perhaps recreating the context is an important way of facilitating retrieval, because all of this knowledge now is in a way non-consolidated, and it needs the contextual detail to be retrieved successfully. In the long term, as you accumulate more experience and you accumulate more knowledge, and you are elaborating on your knowledge as well, so it's not passive, like a passive exposure to the same thing, it's making connections in your learning system, and then your experience and the visual experience or the contextual experience is less significant, is less important actually when you are retrieving information.
So one thing I was going to ask, because it seems like Marshall was touching upon that idea. When you think of your goal as a teacher, as a person who's trying to instill some sort of knowledge into us, it sounds almost like what you're trying to do is help us tear away those concepts, those abstract ideas from a specific context. So we don't need to think, okay, so where was I when I was thinking about this? It's we can independently operate these concepts, these abstract ideas. And I was going to add one thing to it. I wonder what do you think about, yes, you have the abstract idea and you can define it very well, but I also feel, and this is an idea that comes from, again, John Dewey, in particular the book How We Think, which I found really, really quite useful. He says that unless you are capable of applying it in a new context, you actually are not sure. It isn't clear whether you have actually understood it.
Totally agree with that.
Yeah.
So you need to make it yours in a way. You need to absorb it within your experiences, and you need to make different connections with your existing knowledge or new knowledge.
So
as well.
generalize almost.
Generalize, exactly. So this is what abstraction is really, is generalization of the experience. So in order to make it yours, it means that you need to apply it into different contexts. And that's the key to deeper learning, deeper understanding of things. It can be applied in many different domains, obviously. So when you're writing essays, for example, and these will become more obvious as you're progressing with your studies, you will see that one thing that we raise quite a lot actually in our feedback to students is that your arguments weren't deep enough or didn't have enough connections with different examples or different elements of research. This is an indication that actually the knowledge is a bit more superficial, or the understanding, let's say, is a bit more superficial. And once you start actually creating the connections and the applications within different domains, is where you start showing that you have the best understanding of the concept.
Yep,
So
absolutely.
you can demonstrate that you have that abstract, consolidated knowledge.
Yes, in a way, yes. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, I have to say, that's a bit of a philosophy that I have, is that unless I'm able to apply something, and I told you that it comes from that book, How We Think, unless I'm able to apply something in a different context, I really can't say that I understand it. And I really try to differentiate knowing and being able to just parrot an idea and being
Yeah.
able to apply it in some complicated
Mhm.
new environment.
It's an excellent observation, and it's one thing that as teachers we try to do actually. So one thing that was, one aspect of my teaching approach, basically, the last few years, is actually to try and showcase the concepts from different angles,
Yep.
because that way it helps the process of
Right.
consolidation.
And generalization too, because it's
Generalization,
almost like you have
exactly.
more instances from
Yep.
which you can
More
draw the
associations.
Yep,
broader
exactly.
idea. Wow.
Otherwise, it's if it is the same way, if it is just a repetition of the same thing, not from a different angle, but from the same kind of position, the kind of knowledge, the kind of understanding you get is much more superficial.
Mm.
Um, which is quite difficult actually to achieve. Having this kind of the teaching practice is quite complicated in general, and of course, especially when you are teaching in large groups of people, it's quite difficult actually to get feedback on how
Yeah.
people understand the concept. So this is why you need to actually be as diplomatic as possible in your approach. So you need to actually provide all the different angles possibly for a specific topic. So, Marshall would have a different understanding, Hugo would have a different understanding, someone else may have an understanding of a couple of aspects, and these would make learning much more efficient, basically.
Mm.
I always find it interesting to hear psychology lecturers talk about or even just see how they apply their knowledge of learning and psychology to their teaching methods. Like, for example, the multiple choice quizzes that are available alongside the lectures, the live lectures, and also the sort of more short form online content that we can access for those same lectures, those same topics. It applies the theory and it actually makes our own learning
Yeah.
way more effective, because then
Yeah.
we can test ourselves and we can remind ourselves with a different format, like the online format, and have more consolidated knowledge and use the generation effect. So I find that really,
Yeah.
I really like seeing that.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to
And
say.
considering the implications of the theory. So when we are saying, as we said before earlier, that the memory theories and theories in cognition in general tend to be quite abstract, and in a ways sometimes they feel a bit arbitrary, although they're founded on scientific evidence. But by thinking about how we can apply them in everyday life, what kind of implications they may have actually about conditions like dementias, for example, we can actually grasp their ideas, grasp their essence, and extract their essence much better, actually.
Yeah. And again, it you even use the word grasp its essence. It's like making it more
Yeah.
vivid and visual. And yeah, it's really, really fascinating
Yeah.
to me. And what Marshall said about being capable of applying your own understanding in a teaching context, that made me think of another thing. This time, one of the teachers who I admire most, just like a celebrity teacher. Unfortunately, he's not alive anymore, but his name was Richard Feynman. I
All right.
absolutely loved him as a I think he's one of the best educators of all time. And one of the things that he was trying to do is always to explain and kind of elaborate on the implications in the simplest terms possible.
Yeah.
So you take an idea that seems very convoluted and abstract and doesn't bring anything to mind, and then you give one example of it. It's almost like taking snapshots of different conditions of that idea, so that slowly people can generalize their understanding of it. And it seems like so. I never thought about it that way, but it seems so almost simple, and something that I started doing a few
But
years.
it's quite complex.
It is really
Yeah.
complex, I bet, because it means you have to actually understand it, and that really tests your you test yourself as a teacher when you do that. But one thing that I thought about was when I tried to explain more abstract ideas, usually something that helped me was also giving an example of it,
Yeah.
or giving a few examples of it. So again, that seems to relate to what you've been saying, is that by giving an example, you give something to grasp onto, and then from that point on, people can begin to abstract more efficiently.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
And learning and learning experience is quite important actually to all of us. You're students, you learn quite a lot. We're educators, so we try to transfer information and instruct you on the ways we do things in psychology. So if fields like physics and mathematics can do that, and they can actually highlight the implications, practical implications, everyday implications about our experience, then psychology can do this much better actually,
Yeah.
because it's about
Oh,
human
yeah.
life, right? So I'm saying this because when I started teaching, one thing that I came across in student feedback was the fact that quite a lot of psychology students were thinking that what we discuss in cognitive psychology, for example, is not relevant to them.
Mm.
So
Yeah.
there were questions like, why is this relevant to me as a future professional in mental health, let's say?
Yeah. Yeah.
Why is it relevant to me as a future professional in education? Why is it relevant as in a psychology degree at the end of the day? And I think this question is a valid one, of course, no doubt. It's a valid one because we need actually to guide our students on the way to think about the relevance of all of this knowledge. But in a way, it's a bit comical because we are talking about the human mind. So basically, what we're talking about is about the human experience.
Yeah.
So whatever we say about the different theories, the different models, the different scientific evidence should be able to be applied in our everyday experience.
Yeah.
And I think this is the key of the educator actually, to highlight this implication, to highlight this application of the different scientific evidence to everyday life. And as I said, if mathematicians and physicists can do this,
Yeah.
then we can do
Yeah,
this much
certainly.
better. much more
Psychologists sure as
efficiently.
hell should be able to. Yeah.
Yeah.
Certainly.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it's a matter of basically find the right ways of doing it, finding the most efficient ways. And as we said earlier, it's quite complex. It may seem simple because, as you said, one aspect of it is to simplify the ideas, but the process itself is quite complex because of the complexity of the issue.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'd like to link that. We were talking about how psychological theories can be applied in more ways than you might realize, and you were talking about simplifying ideas. To show and to be able to understand them better, you have to be able to explain them simply. I think that does apply to mental health and even therapy. I've been reading Carl Rogers, and I think at the basis of that kind of person-centered therapy is listening, and a big part of listening is repeating back to somebody what they say. And a lot of people who have not been listened to very much in their lives, not had people to talk to about these complex, abstract things that they're struggling with, to talk to somebody about that, it might be a mess. All the things they're saying might not really make sense. It might be really incoherent. And to have somebody who's really good at listening, repeat it back to them, really without changing any of the content, but making it a bit more simple, making it a bit more. It's a professional that's doing this, a professional listener, really. That's really useful for the person because they can even understand what they said to you better just by hearing it back from another person, another brain with more cognitive brain power. Not more, but at least double.
Specialized for solving the kinds of problems that you are facing right now.
Exactly. And having conversations with people gives you that chance to have not necessarily their interpretation, but their simplification and their listening helps you to understand things better yourself. So I think that's something that you can really apply, that principle of learning and taking something that's more abstract and being able to verbalize it helps you to understand it in a different way. And by understanding it, you give yourself the capacity to improve and to heal.
Definitely.
Wow.
And it's a very good observation because it's the link with mental health and the clinical psychology aspect and the therapeutic implications. All of these fields have been affected quite a lot by cognitive psychology, obviously. CBT is basically the application of cognitive theories into ways to change the way we think, the way we behave, and the way we act as well. But even, in therapeutic theories that are not that obvious, like as you said, Rogers' approach and the client-centered approach, basically, it uses cognitive tools in order to provide the means to the client, to the patient, to the person, to actually approach the problems and the difficulties from a different aspect, from a different angle again. And it's it's a very good observation what you said about the therapist to be able actually to do this kind of thing. So you're saying something as a client, as a therapist, the therapist should be able actually to summarize what you said in a better way, in a more efficient way, perhaps. And this would be efficient for you actually to perceive the kind of difficulty you see. So the therapist needs to be able to go close to your situation, but then to come out of the situation in order to abstract basically the essence of your problems or the essence of what the client says. So a lot of these techniques have a basis in cognitive psychology theories.
Yeah.
In modern neuroscience, we talk about a lot about unconscious effects or subconscious processing. Where do we find this idea? We find it in psychoanalysis. Basically, modern neuroscience and modern cognitive neuroscience specifically is not incompatible with these therapeutic ideas, these more practical applications. In fact, they go so close together that the fields of cognitive psychology and clinical psychology feed each other information about these practical implications. Right?
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sure you could talk about that to no end. I wish we had more time because, yeah, like you were saying with the psychoanalysis, maybe that's sort of trying to bring unconscious things that maybe can only be explained from a neurological perspective if they're not conscious to consciousness, and that's healing. And cognitive behavior therapy is like there are rational and destructive schema. We talk about schemas a lot.
Yep. And even the template, as we said, this kind of creating expectations about the experience, it's not a conscious process. We're not going down the street thinking,
yeah, exactly.
well, what do I expect to see now? We don't really. We don't necessarily focus our attention on these aspects. So there are processes that happen subconsciously.
Yeah, yeah. And the behaviors and I guess being more aware of how your behaviors may be destructive and and harming you.
I mean, relating to what you've been saying, something that I saw parallels with between your thoughts about psychoanalysis and just therapy, because I know that you're interested in that, and your understanding of teaching. It sounds like there's so much similar between those two processes that in some ways being a good therapist is almost like being a good teacher in that you help illuminate the parts that are important about this subject. So in the case of the teacher, in particular someone who studies cognition like yourself, it may be some aspect of memory that you want to illuminate and clarify, whereas in a therapist's case it might be what is the problem of depression and what are the components, the subcomponents of it that cause it to occur, and then how can we break those down to then be able to resolve that issue.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there are therapeutic approaches which have adopted a much more educational aspect. So CBT has done that basically.
Yeah.
So it is based a lot on learning experience.
Yeah.
And
a lot of practical exercises.
Exactly.
From
so
my
basically, the
understanding.
therapist is an educator, trying actually to showcase ways of doing things differently or looking at things from different angles again. Yeah, that's a very good observation.
Yeah, I wonder if even therapists who are not CBT therapists and have less of a direct educational role for the client are still teachers in a unique way. Maybe even the best kinds of teachers, where they're not telling the client anything, but they're kind of holding their hand and learning with them and facilitating learning without directly teaching them anything, but seeing what the client can learn about themselves. So in a way, maybe all therapists are kind of teachers.
Yeah. I mean, relating to what you're saying, I think for me it's easier to conceptualize what a good therapist is by thinking, okay, what would be a really bad therapist, or what would be
Yeah.
a really bad teacher, and think, okay, someone who just completely ignores what you're saying, so
Yep.
doesn't try to extend your understanding, doesn't listen to your ideas, so doesn't try to help you generalize, and provides really poor examples that don't fit in with your actual issue. So maybe they ignore what your issue is,
Yep.
or say prejudge what that issue may be, and just stick with that. But there's a disconnect between that and what you're struggling through. So it's clear to me that there's parallels in that sense, and maybe in that way, being a good therapist and being a good teacher is being able to really absorb that individual student's needs
Yeah.
and try to understand them authentically, and then given that context, try to offer some very calm and slight
Nudges.
Yeah, I think that's a
questions,
good way to describe it.
Yep,
Nudges.
totally agree with
Yeah,
that. And it's a very subtle kind of balance when you are teaching something from, to give, there is a huge difference from lecturing somebody and being patronizing,
Yeah,
basically,
exactly.
as an authority, to actually guiding the student, guiding the receiver of the information through the process of learning. And it's, as I said, it's a very kind of a thin line between the two of them. But I think the most efficient ways of educating is actually to guide the student in finding out more about the topic, approaching the topic from different angles, as we said, and apply their own understanding, their own experiences to it, make it theirs actually, and that's the, as we said, grasping the idea of something is quite important. It means that you have made it yours.
Yeah.
Actually. Definitely.
Wow. Well, thank you so much for joining us
My
today.
pleasure.
I cannot wait for us to continue this at another date.
Yes.
I'm sure that
Of course, yeah.
I'd love to have you on again. Thank you so much, Alex. Thank you so much, Marshall.
Thank you
Always
for
a
having me.
pleasure.
Thank you.
Thanks so much.